We are warmly welcoming you, Professor Fernando Reimersdir.
I'm delighted to be with you, Lala.
Hörmətli professor, sizə bir daha təşəkkürümüzü bildiririk.
All right, thank you so much, Professor.
Əziz təhsil sevərlər, Harvard dərsindəyik. Təhsil TV və T-Network'ün yeni layihəsi olan Harvard dərsində hər birinizi təhsilə dərin sevgi ilə salamlayırıq. Proqramın əsas məqsədi təhsildə aktual olan məsələləri müzakirə etmək, bu müzakirələr ilə Azərbaycan 2030 sosial-iqtisadi inkişafa dair milli prioritetlərdə təhsillə bağlı qarşıya qoyulan məqsədlərə nail olmağa töhfə vermək, təhsildə keyfiyyətə yeni baxış təqdim etməkdir. Bu məqsədlə proqramın qonaqları Harvard Universitetinin professor-müəllim heyəti, o cümlədən nəticələri ilə seçilən tələbə və məzunlardır. Harvard dərsi Harvard Universitetində xaricdə təhsil üzrə dövlət proqramı çərçivəsində təhsilin siyasəti və təhlili üzrə magistratura təhsil alan Lalə Əliyevanın və T-Network platformasının rəhbəri olaraq mənim təqdimatımda yayımlanır. Bir məqamı böyük fəxr və qürurla qeyd etmək istəyirik. Azərbaycan Respublikasının prezidenti cənab İlham Əliyevin sərəncamı ilə təsdiq edilən gənclərin xarici ölkələrin nüfuzlu ali təhsil müəssisələrində təhsil almalarına dair 2022-2028-ci illər üzrə dövlət proqramını böyük fəxr və minnətdarlıqla vurğulamaq istəyirik. Bu proqram sayəsində minlərlə gənc reytingli ali təhsil müəssisələrində dövlət hesabına təhsil almaq imkanı əldə edir. Fürsətdən istifadə edərək proqramın ərsəyə gəlməsində əmək olan hər kəsə, dəyərli qonaqlarımıza xüsusi təşəkkür edirik. Harvard dərsindən daha çox həmkarınızın faydalanması üçün proqramı həmkarlarınız ilə paylaşmağı unutmayın. İndi isə söz dəyərli həmkarım, əziz pedaqoq Lalə Əliyevanındır.
Çox təşəkkür edirəm Cəfər bəy təqdimatınız üçün. Bu layihə həqiqətən mənim üçün çox dəyərli bir layihədir. Həm Harvard Universitetində təhsil alan bir tələbə kimi, həm də vətəndaşlıq borcumu yerinə yetirməli olduğum, Azərbaycan təhsil auditoriyasına çatdırmalı olduğum mesajlar bu proyektdə öz əksini tapdığı üçün özümü çox xoşbəxt hiss edirəm. Bugün ilk verilişimizdir və xeyirli uğurlu olmasını arzulayıram. İnşallah davamlı olmasını arzulayıram. Harvard Universitetinin beynəlxalq təhsil üzrə Ford fondu tərəfindən dəstəklənən professoru və Harvard Universitetinin nəzdində qlobal təhsil innovasiyaları təşəbbüsünün direktoru professor Fernando Reimersdir qarşılamaq bizim üçün çox böyük şərəfdir. Professor Reimers təhsildə innovasiya və islahatlar sayəsində dünya miqyasında tanınan bir liderdir. Bugün o bizimlə gələcəyin çağırışlarına cavab verə biləcək, şagird və müəllimlərin hazırlanması ilə bağlı dəyərli təcrübələrini bölüşəcək. Professor Fernando Reimersdir səmimi şəkildə salamlayıram və mən nəzərinizə çatdırmaq istəyirəm ki, Cəfər bəy, Harvard Universitetində star, yəni ulduz professorlar var ki, Professor Reimers onlardan biridir. Öz qlobal təcrübəsi ilə, yəni öz təhsilə verdiyi töhfələrlə, xüsusən də təhsil siyasəti sahəsində və beynəlxalq təhsil sektorunda çox böyük tanınmış bir fiqurdur və mən çox böyük məmnuniyyətlə onu hal-hazırda sizə təqdim edirəm.
Təşəkkür edirəm dəyərli Lalə xanım. Cənab Fernando, sizinlə yenidən görüşmək olduqca xoşdur.
Thank you, Professor, so much for joining us and for accepting our invitation. And you're really, it's very, it's very pleasure. And we were waiting in excitement that, oh my God, when is he going to join? Does he have so busy schedule or not? Thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
All right, now I'll start.
And it's very good to see Jafar, who I have met in the past. I have done interviews with him for his program, as you probably know.
Yes, we know, actually. Yeah, he has a very good experience with you. And I hope our collaboration will continue.
Delighted to be with you.
Thank you.
Cənab Reimers, valideynləriniz İspaniyada doğulub, Venezuelaya köç ediblər. Özünüz isə Venezuelada anadan olub, ABŞ-da böyüyüb təhsil almışsınız. Həmçinin fransız miqrantlarının təhsil etdiyi məktəbdə oxumusunuz. Bu keçidlər sizin təhsil vizyonunuza necə təsir edib? Ümumiyyətlə maraqlıdır. Harvardla yolunuz necə kəsişib?
So indeed, I was born in Venezuela. My parents were immigrants, and they sent me to a small school that had been created by French teachers. It was a very small school, and I think that school influenced my curiosity in education in several ways. It was a school that I think was ahead of its time in trying to create conditions to educate the whole child. While there was a very rigorous academic focus, for example, in mathematics, in sciences, in language, in history, there was also a lot of attention to the arts. So, for example, in that school, every child was involved in some kind of an art project. I always participated in theater. Every year, the entire school produced a theatrical performance that would be presented to the parents at the end of the school year. But there was also an emphasis in engaging with nature. The school was located in a huge, beautiful place that had all kinds of trees and so on. And we spent a lot of time. We took excursions as children in some of the woods that were around the school. So I would say that for a relatively small school, there was a big balance in terms of the emphasis of the curriculum. And there was also attention to social-emotional learning. For example, one of the practices that was used in the school is what we now call restorative practices. When students have conflicts of any sort, which can happen in any school, restorative practices consist of making students aware of the perspectives of different parties in the conflict. So, for example, one of the things that happened in that school, when a kid got into a fight with another kid, the teacher tried to mediate and help them solve it. But if they couldn't, they sent us to the principal, to the office of the principal. And what the principal did was a very simple practice. It had each child present to the other their perspective. Why had they been offended? Why had they been insulted in some way? And then ask the other child to repeat what they had heard. And then ask the other child to present the problem from their point of view. And that very simple exercise, which we realize symbolically was very important in the school because it took place in the office of the principal with two children listening to each other. It didn't involve the principal telling us what the solution was. It didn't involve the principal taking sides. It basically involved practicing the ability to see a situation from the point of view of another. And oftentimes, someone had done something wrong, and the principal involved us in the process of deciding what should be the correction here. And the correction might involve presenting an apology or doing something to the party that had. So the reason I bring up that example is because it's a very simple way to illustrate how social-emotional learning and academic learning are not either or. How a good education is about integrating the development of the whole child, of the academics, of the social-emotional, and it's also about helping children develop their own voice, knowing that they are respected, that they can be listened to. So I think those early experiences certainly influence my views on education. The fact that that was a school in which there were children from all over the world, because in this particular period, Venezuela was open to many immigrants, I think also developed a curiosity on my part, a respect for cultural difference. I kind of came to understand very early on that the world is a very big place, that we have a lot of things in common, that we also have differences that are to be celebrated. So in retrospect, I realized I was extremely lucky to be able to experience early on in my life an education that I now consider actually very empowering. And I consider having provided me a foundation to feel at ease and comfortable in the world, to be curious about the many differences that constitute our humanity, and to be able to identify our shared humanity across those differences.
Thank you so much for that great I am really very impressed while listening to you, Professor. I was actually preparing to ask you questions about social emotional learning, but you just immediately mentioned that one even without asking. And
I'm happy to talk more about social emotional learning if you want.
yes, I know this is your lovely topic. Thank you so much for sharing. And sometimes while talking to you, actually, kind of you are predicting what I'm going to ask you, and this is your kind of pedagogy feeling, and this is really very great. That's why I love you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay, so next question is about the integration of artificial intelligence into education system. And what do you think that? Do you think that it's going to have a significant paradigm shift in the future for educators? Because it's kind of mixed reaction in the society. Some people are welcoming and some teachers are really very worried about the artificial intelligence. Maybe they are just worried about losing their jobs. I'm not sure yet. But what do you think? How would you articulate your perspective on navigating this complex era shaped by artificial intelligence? Do you think that's going to be more collaborative with teachers, or it's going to create a divergence in the system?
So as you know, my work over the last 15 years has been about the relationship between the work that schools do and the social context in which they are embedded. And I see that relationship as being two ways. On the one hand, schools can help students develop ideas, skills, values that help them improve the world that they inhabit, make it better than it is. For example, in many places of the world, there is prejudice, bigotry. People don't have the skills to solve their differences respectfully or peacefully. And as a result of that, there is violence. There is violence in communities, within societies, across societies. I think schools can help students imagine a better world than this. And it can help them gain skills through the practices such as the one I mentioned of restorative justice in schools, so that they are able to construct a world that is better than the world that they inhabit. At the same time, what happens outside of schools influences schools. The context in which schools live changes very rapidly. Climate changes, politics change, economic changes, and schools need to prepare students to understand those changes. In some ways, these are some of the ideas in my book, Educating Students to Improve the World, which, as you know, is easy to obtain, is an open access book. Anyone can find it if they just Google that title and can download it. So artificial intelligence, the development of artificial intelligence, which, as you know, is not a new thing. People have been working on artificial intelligence and on machine learning for more than half a century. But what is now new is one particular implementation of artificial intelligence called large language models, which are basically predictive models that, based on large bodies of text, can predict text. So essentially, when humans interact with these models, you have the feeling that you are interacting with an intelligent being. But there is nothing really intelligent about artificial intelligence. This is simply a computer program that has been coded to analyze large bodies of text, and on the basis of that analysis, generate text and then interact with humans. But it is true that these are very powerful methodologies. These are very powerful methodologies that can help us do things that were unimaginable. For example, you want to plan a trip to visit a new city efficiently, and you can go into one of these large language models, Gemini or ChatGPT or Copilot, and say, I'm going to visit Berlin and I'm going to spend 2 days. I would like to see the major historical sites, organize an itinerary for me that would be very efficient. And you can get something that is a very good prediction of what that would be. You could also say, I'm especially interested in history, so give me an itinerary to do that. You could say, I'm very interested in ethnic German cuisine, give me an itinerary. So there are many tasks that one of these large language models can perform with great accuracy. And so then the question is, what are the implications of this development for education? Well, I think that there are at least two implications. The first one is how do we develop the skills among students so that they understand this technology and what it can do and its limitations? And I call that, and others have called that, AI literacy. Artificial intelligence should become a new literacy that schools should do. Should it replace other things like foundational literacy? Absolutely not. We still need to be able to read. Should it replace scientific literacy? No. So I don't see the development of AI literacy as something that should replace things that schools are doing, but as something that should be incorporated. And I think it should be incorporated not necessarily as its own subject, but it should be integrated into the existing subjects. Students should understand certainly how to use these models. They should understand what they can do, also the shortcomings, and they should, at least some of them, have the skills to build using those knowledge. And that requires computational thinking, and that requires coding skills, and so on. So in that sense, that development in the social context is like any other change that requires that we equip students with the skills to understand it. I would say the same thing about climate change. It's a phenomenon that is affecting our lives, and students should have the skills to understand it. The other thing that AI could do is it could help us transform how we teach and how we learn. I don't think it's going to substitute teachers, but there are some things that AI can do very effectively. For example, I have, as you know, Lala, because you have been my student, I have begun to integrate artificial intelligence in my teaching, in my courses in education policy, in my courses on educational innovation. And so one of the things that AI can do is it's very easy to develop what's called a chatbot. And that's what's a chatbot? It's simply a way to get these large language models to interact with a human based on some body of text, either the body of text in which the large language model has been trained, or a selected body of text that you curate so that this chatbot can interact based on that. And that's very useful. And that's very useful because I think it's a very good complement to what many teachers can do. I think it can complement the relationship between teachers and students in a way that adds a very valuable layer of personalization. There are shortcomings to what the chatbot can do because, for example, there may be biases in the responses that this chatbot gives you, which are included in the large bodies of text in which it has been embedded. So I'm not suggesting in any way that a chatbot is necessarily going to help us abandon the school as we have known it, but I do think it could help us enrich the schools as we have known it. For example, South Korea has done something very, very clever. It has taken the textbooks, the national textbooks, and additional reference resources, and then used them as a curated body of text to train a chatbot so that students can use those textbooks in much more interactive ways. Is the chatbot replacing the book? No, it's making it possible for the students to interact with the book in a way that is responsive to the different levels of interest, different levels of understanding, of mastery of the curriculum by the students. So I think that is very, very beneficial. There are other ways in which we could use artificial intelligence to enhance the student experience. I will give you an example. A very simple thing that I do in my classes is students have to write several papers, as you know. And when I ask the students to write a paper, these are research papers, I describe what the paper should be about, and I provide students what is known as a rubric. So a rubric is something that defines what are the standards that I'm going to use to grade that paper. Well, I encourage my own students to, before they submit a paper, when they have a draft, upload it to ChatGPT and then say, let's say Lala is doing this. I'm a student in Professor Reimers's class in education policy. I have to write a paper for his course on comparative education policy. This is the description of the assignment. This is the rubric. Please provide me feedback to a draft of this paper as if you were Professor Reimers. And then you upload your draft. And ChatGPT is going to give you feedback. I don't think you should take this feedback mechanically or mindlessly or at faith. You should think about what you're getting. Some of what you get may be silly, but it is a good way to have an interactive body. In this case, I mean, it's not a human being. We shouldn't be confused about that. A body that can help you personalize the material. So I apologize for the long answer, but I think AI is both a change in our context that requires that we understand it, that we have the skills to function in that world, and it's also potentially a tool to help us improve education. Should we be scared of AI? Well, not anymore that we should be scared of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, safe nuclear energy, is a wonderful alternative to carbon fossil fuels. It could be one of the solutions to diversify the forms of energy we use to minimize our carbon footprint in the environment. Of course, nuclear energy can also be used for very destructive purposes, to build nuclear bombs and to wipe out entire populations. But whether we use nuclear energy for peaceful or warlike purposes has nothing to do with nuclear energy. It has to do with developing humans, which is why, again, I think it's so important that we educate whole human beings that are not only technically proficient, but also ethically savvy, who are more advanced in their understanding, who behave in a way that is cooperative, that is collaborative, that is respectful of the entirety of humanity. And so in that sense, no, I'm not scared of AI, like I'm not scared of any scientific development. I'm scared of ignorant humans who can use all this knowledge to cause harm and pain and violence. And I think one of the ways to prevent having too many ignorant humans is to educate all of humanity and to educate them well.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. And coming back to social emotional learning, that's really very important in modern era. And actually, when we had classes together, and your main priority was integrating social emotional learning into modern curriculum. But as you know, unfortunately, we don't have specific, techniques or measurements that yet we can understand, for example, how to which extent we have measured and to which extent we have achieved that social emotional learning is implemented. Specifically in test-driven systems, it's really very hard sometimes to concentrate on that perspective of education. But what would be your opinion about this situation? How would you recommend to modern teachers, pedagogues, or the system generally to integrate SEL to modern teaching and curriculum?
Yeah. So let me begin providing a big conceptual framework. I think that the social-emotional development of students can be developed through a range of strategies that include what you're calling social-emotional learning, which are basically strategies that can help students build emotional skills, develop a language to even recognize emotions and to be able to name emotions and to manage their own emotions. It can also help strengthen relationships among people and in general create a positive school climate, a climate where people feel that they belong, in which people feel that they can contribute and so on. But another key strategy is what is called strength-based trauma and mental health support. And that's basically helping teachers develop the skills to build on students' strength. So many times, schools see students from the point of view of what they lack, as opposed to seeing what they bring, the assets that they bring, right? But a third strategy are what are called restorative practices. I was mentioning the practice that was used by the principal of my elementary school of repairing harm by making it possible for students to listen to each other and to find a resolution. So basically, restorative practices are about fostering community, repairing harm, and helping to build trust rather than simply punishing community. And then lastly, coordinating whole school efforts to build an ecology for families, for communities, where there is collaboration and so on. So that's all to say that social-emotional learning is not a single bullet. It's not a course, it's an approach. Now, there are a number of drivers of that, of which assessment is one, but I think the most important thing I want to underscore here is that social-emotional learning is not an alternative to academic learning. Social-emotional learning provides a supportive condition, a foundation so that students can learn. See, the pandemic made that very visible. We discovered during the pandemic that nobody learns very much when they are afraid. And we knew that during the pandemic, especially before we had vaccines, a lot of people were in fear for their lives, because they knew that if they were infected, some people might not survive the infection of COVID-19. And so that is one reason why during the pandemic, many education systems made an effort, even in the time of remote education, to create the conditions for well-being, to create the conditions for students to feel valued, to feel included, by doing simple things like asking every student, how are you doing? How are things going for you? Now, the reason I'm mentioning that social-emotional learning is really the foundation of academic learning is because we shouldn't think of social-emotional learning as reducing the academic rigor, not asking students to perform, giving everybody an A. That has nothing to do with social-emotional learning. And so the development of students' social-emotional competencies can actually enhance the motivation to learn. See, when a teacher takes the time to get to know the students, to get to know what interests them, to get to know their goals, and when the student feels that they matter to the teacher, that actually develops the motivation to learn and the engagement of the students. And those are foundational to learning. So how can this be done? Before we get to assessment, how can this be done? Well, there are different ways to do it. You can embed the practices I'm describing within this academic content of the curriculum, not as an add-on, but inside. For example, if you're teaching language, literature is a wonderful way to develop an awareness of emotions. I was recently watching a wonderful French film about the Count of Monte Cristo. It's this old novel written, I'm trying to remember the name. I think it was Alexandre Dumas, if I am not mistaken. I read that book as a child, and I had never read it again. And I watched the film, and I realized how many emotions this work of art, of literature, is exploring a whole range of emotions: love, envy, generosity, solidarity, cruelty. And so in the course of language arts, as students discuss literature, fiction, they can discuss emotions and motivations, which is a wonderful way to help them develop perspective. Perspective taking, the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another, is a foundational social-emotional skill. That's what my school principal was doing. But for example, you can also embed social-emotional learning in science when you provide opportunities for students to collaborate with each other. Let me tell you, Laila, I teach in a graduate school where it's not easy to be admitted to Harvard. So these are very well-educated people. And I absolutely require my students to collaborate in projects. And I do it because I know that in order to be successful, they're going to have to collaborate. You may not be surprised that some people have a very hard time to collaborating. So you have to wonder, how is it possible that people are admitted at Harvard University? In an academic sense, they are very accomplished, and they lack the basic collaborative skills to organize their work, to communicate, to work in teams, and so on. Similarly, in mathematics education, you can provide students tasks that promote discussion, reasoning, persistence, and all those things build academic resilience. So that's one way to do it. You embed SEL in the curriculum. The other one is you align standards and competencies, right? So your national curriculum frameworks can add SEL competencies. For example, self-management, responsible decision-making, and cross-cutting what are called 21st century skills, which, as you know, has been the focus of my work for 15 years. And I'd be delighted to talk a little bit more about 21st century skills. So you can include those in the curriculum. Every curriculum can have what are called dual objective, an academic objective, a cognitive objective, and a social-emotional objective. You can also, what is the third thing you can do? You can educate, you can train educators to integrate social-emotional learning into their pedagogies. How? Creating inclusive environments that are emotionally supportive, right? I occasionally know of teachers who mock their students in public, who embarrass their students, right? This creates a very harmful environment for people to feel safe, to feel that they can take risks. Teachers can use discussion, feedback, reflection to help people develop social emotional awareness. They can create an environment of psychological safety, emotional safety, which, as you know, is essential for people to actually say what they think, trust others, and so on. And there are simple things that can be done. A practice that I use in my class is very simple. I use what are called Chatham House rules. And Chatham House rules simply say, I want you to be free in this class. But in order to be free, you have to trust that whatever you say in this class is not going to have negative consequences for you outside this class. So in this day and age in which so many people are in social media, occasionally someone not thinking would say, oh, I was in a discussion in a class with Professor Reimers, and in that class, Lalə Əliyevanın said that Cəfər Mənsiminin doesn't know what he's doing. I'm kidding, obviously. This is not true. But imagine if somebody sent a tweet like that, it would destroy the career of Lalə Əliyevanın, because Cəfər Mənsiminin is a very well-respected public figure. People trust him. And so what do? You tell people in the class, you can say anything you think, and you can tell others what you learn, but you cannot, without their permission, say what a person said in this class. And when you do that, and you live by those principles, people feel that they can trust others. And when there is trust, you can have a very different kind of conversation than when you're afraid. You, of course, can also use assessments to enhance the integration of social emotional learning, right? For example, assessing collaboration, providing opportunities for students to present their work together, providing feedback for students to self-regulate, and so on. Drawing on evidence on social emotional learning to support academic learning. And so basic idea I'm stressing is that we should think of SEL as a foundation and not as replacing. So there are many examples of that, and I'd be happy to give you some. But then to your key question, how can we monitor? Well, you've heard me in this analysis describe many of the conditions that characterize an environment in which there is social-emotional inclusion. You can monitor those. You can monitor, for example, you can ask students a very simple question. Do you think that your teacher cares about you? And you can collect that information, and you can share that information with the teacher so that they know what their students think. Or you can ask students, do you feel safe in this class? Do you feel that you can really say what you're thinking? When you do work, do you think that your colleagues want you to learn? So you can collect information on classroom culture, the classroom environment, and use that as a measure to keep the temperature, to check the emotional temperature of a class. You can also assess students' development in some of these dimensions. You can assess perspective taking. So I'm not saying that you should inundate a school with all these measurements, because the task of the school is primarily to support instruction. But just like we can assess if students are learning mathematics or language, we can also assess if they are evolving, right? We can all tell. Well, occasionally I encounter students who, even at Harvard, are so undeveloped emotionally. You feel sad that they have spent so many years in school and they really lack basic empathy, basic awareness of how their actions impact other people. And you worry about them. And so I think that the first thing to do is to understand what do we mean, to develop a vocabulary for social emotional learning, to understand how these can be expressed in education. And I've given you some examples. And then we can develop some measurements to especially help us keep track of what's happening, provide formative feedback. I'll give you an example. There's a very famous psychometrician. His name is Doug Wilms in Canada, who began his career measuring very traditional academic subjects, mathematics and science. And about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, he began to do this work in the province of New Brunswick about measuring the academic climate in a classroom. And every week, he basically worked with all the schools in the province, and a sample of students in every classroom, a small sample, just 10 students, would be asked on their cell phones or on their computers, just 5 questions of the sort: do you think that your teacher wants you to learn? Do you feel safe with your classmates? And he collected that information on a Friday at the end of a week and basically created a program to analyze that information, gave the feedback to the teacher on Monday. And just providing teacher this feedback had a tremendous impact in improving the emotional climate in the school. Because sometimes teachers don't know how their students are experiencing the classroom. So nowadays, it's so easy to collect feedback, right? To ask questions. And even if nobody answers, or not everybody answers, just some people, at least to have some idea of how students are experiencing the classroom can be very valuable. I'm sorry that I've given you this long answer, but I think what I'm trying to underscore is that there are no mechanical solutions in education, right? We shouldn't just jump and say, give me a measurement. What we need are thoughtfully designed and conceived ways to improve education, which need to begin with clearly articulated goals, with a good foundation for what you're trying to do, and then good measurement will follow. I hope this is helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of culture and mindset change is playing an important role here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor.
Biz bu sualla məncə davam edə bilərik. Azərbaycan hazırda erkən uşaqlıq təhsilinin genişləndirilməsinə və təkmilləşdirilməsinə daha çox diqqət yetirir. Qlobal təcrübənizə əsasən güclü və bərabər hüquqlu məktəbəqədər təhsil sisteminin inkişafını, xüsusilə K12 sistemini öz təhsil sisteminə yeni inteqrasiya edən keçid təhsili sistemlərində hansı təməl prinsiplər rəhbər tutmalıdır sizcə?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is that I'm delighted to hear that in Azerbaijan, people understand that learning begins at birth and that it's important to support the development of children before the official age of entry to elementary school, which in many countries is 5, 6, or 7 years. Of course, it's a very long period in the life of a child from 0 to 5. It's also a critical period from the point of view of the development of the brain. It's a period in which the brain is growing physically very fast and a lot of connections are forming. So those early experiences are very critical, not only to the cognitive development of the child, but also to their physical development and also to their emotional development. So creating a supportive ecosystem is important. And the first thing that I would do in any system is to ask, where are the children at this period in life? Now, in many societies, at least a percentage of the children are in their homes, being cared by one of their parents or by grandparents, by what I would call an informal support system. So I think it's very important to strengthen that informal support system so that those care providers do their best job educating students. I will give you an example. One of the things that is essential to the development of the child is the interaction with adults. The interaction where even before they can speak, where the child does something, smiles or goos, and someone else responds, right? This back and forth is important. But there are many societies in which the cultural norms are such that until children talk, adults really don't interact much with them. They ignore them. This is harmful. This is a harmful cultural practice. And so I think it's important to find ways to educate parents and grandparents and other adults that are part of the life of the children how important it is to have this interaction. Similarly, from the point of view of the development of language of children, it's very important to engage children in conversation, for children to hear people talking, to hear them talking to them, for children to know that what they say or what they try to say has an effect in others. So again, I've been in many places where I have seen parents with more and with less education that are not aware of the power that they have to help develop the language of children. So I was saying, what's important in building that ecosystem? First of all, ask, where are the children at the moment, and strengthen that ecosystem. I said a good percentage of children in many places are in their homes. In other places, they are in semi-institutionalized environments. So somebody in a community creates a small daycare center where they basically take care of the children of other parents. And it could be a very small enterprise, maybe only 5 children, 10, 15. it's very important that those people are also well equipped, well educated, well supported, so that they don't just care for the children, but they develop the children. Care and development are not the same thing. Care is important, of course, but development is even more important. So I'll give you an example. One of the difficult things when you're an adult and you're working with very little kids is that they have a lot of needs. And sometimes they make noise and they can't communicate very well, so they cry. And these can disorient the adult. And some adults have responses where they try to control the situation that are actually harmful. In some places, people use physical punishment, corporal punishment for kids. Horrible thing. The harm that corporal punishment causes over the long term is enormous. So anyone who's caring for children should be educated on that harm and should be given better ways to manage a group of kids, right? To manage even discipline, to make sure that they listen and so on. So that's the second space. Sometimes these informal or semi-formal care centers. And then lastly, there are these institutionalized centers. And very often when governments say that they are interested in early childhood, that's what they mean. They mean that they are going to create one preschool, one kindergarten class in a school or begin earlier. And that has its advantages. It tends to be very expensive because in order to do that very well, you need to have small groups of kids. You can't put a group of 3-year-olds. You cannot have 40 of them or even 30 in the care of one adult. That ratio doesn't work because those children demand a lot more attention. So if you're going to have institutionalized settings for early care, it's very important that they're of high quality. And high quality means the people in charge need to be very well prepared, and the ratio has to be a good ratio, and the environment has to be safe and supportive. And so I hope what you hear is I have described an ecosystem that is in charge of caring for children and developing them. And a good national strategy to promote child development shouldn't just be about that classroom of kindergarten, should be about strengthening the entire ecosystem. Now, if a country has the resources to put all the children in institutionalized environments of high quality, and if the parents want that, fantastic. I don't think anyone should be forced to put their children there. Some parents make the choice. They prefer their kids to be with their grandparents than to be in a center when they're very little. And I think that should be respected. I think that there may be good reasons why the parents want that. So I guess what I'm saying is that the development of policy for early care and education should be done very thoughtfully, attending to scientific evidence on what constitutes healthy development for children, recognizing that there are many different environments in which this can be done, not a single thing, strengthening all those environments, but respecting the right of parents when they have the right knowledge to make the decision they consider best for their children.
Thank you so much, Professor. These are really important lessons that I learned in your class, but also I'm very happy that we are also delivering this message to the audience of Azerbaijan. Thank you so much, Professor. But our last questions are related with Azerbaijan, and we try to contextualize them. Cəfər, if you want, you can continue with the next question about Azerbaijan.
Siz davam edə bilərsiniz istəyirsiniz.
Okay, all right. Professor, there is an ongoing shift in Azerbaijan towards transforming some public schools into public legal entities in order to promote more autonomy and innovation, and education is being transitioned to a per capita funding system. What do you think? What are your thoughts on such governance reforms? Do you think that it's bringing to more, impactful consequences for final outcomes?
So I don't know the full context of education of Azerbaijan and what the needs are and why this particular option is being chosen to have an informed opinion on this particular policy, whether it makes sense or not. But I will make a general comment on the question of school autonomy. I do think that in education, it makes sense for educational decisions to be made by the people who are closer to the issue that they're making a decision about. So, for example, we were just talking a moment ago about pedagogies. The people who should be empowered to make decisions about what particular pedagogical approaches are more effective to teach a particular group of students should be the teachers of those students. So, in some contexts, for a particular group of students, for a particular subject, the best pedagogy may be collaborative learning. In others, it may be whole class instruction. In others, it may be some small group activities. I don't think the government should regulate and say, from now on, everybody's going to use collaborative learning and so on. That would be silly because a national government is too far away from the point at which that decision impacts opportunity to make the best decision. Similarly, if you take a school organization, I could say that the place where decisions should be made about who should teach in a school is the school itself. The school principal or others in the school should decide who's the most qualified person to teach our students, to teach in this community. And in many countries, the appointment of teachers is made in the Ministry of Education, which is so far away from the school. How can the ministry even know who is the right person to teach in that school? So that's the general principle. Given that principle, I do think that there are many education systems, especially in early stages of development, where too many decisions are made in a centralized way, in a way that actually produces decisions that are not good. So, for example, when ministries are the ones that make the appointments of teachers, very often they take a long time. They appoint teachers who are very far away. They appoint teachers who sometimes don't have expertise in the area. The school needs a math teacher and they appoint a history teacher. Why do they do that? Because it's too far away, too removed from the school. There aren't good information systems to make good decisions. So that's the case for decentralizing some decisions, for devolving the authority for some decisions to the level of governance that has the best information about the problem that concerns that decision. And I think in that sense, providing schools more autonomy to make some decisions that impact the life of the school makes sense, provided the people in the school have the information to make a good decision and have the training, the skills to make a good decision. So you realize I'm not saying everything should be decided by the school or not be decided. I think this is a subtle issue that requires attention to context, attention to the capacities that people have. But in general, if you ask me, should teachers be making some decisions about the education of their students? Of course. Should principals be making some decisions? Of course. Should school districts be making some decisions? Of course. And should ministries make some decisions? The second aspect of your question was move to a model I can understand that in some contexts, in order to give autonomy to the school, you need to give them a legal authority so they can execute budgets, right? If you're not a legal entity, you cannot be accountable for public resources. So if you're going to give the school, for example, the ability to hire teachers and fire teachers and the resources to do that, the school needs to be a legal entity. Otherwise, they're not capable of engaging in contracts. So I understand that. The shift towards equal spending, basically some countries do that. They say, let's basically decide what is the funding per student, and we're going to distribute that money equally based on how many students you have. Whether that is a good or bad idea, again, depends on the context. In some settings, the situation is very uneven, and you have some schools where per pupil spending is, even in public schools, is many times what it is in other settings, producing something that could be very unequitable. Very often, those inequities work against the students who are more marginalized. For example, students in rural areas. They have less political voice, their schools have been created more recently, and so on. So if the policy of equalizing spending is trying to correct for those inequalities, that seems to me like a step forward. It's a step that is recognizing a wrong in the system, a wrong in the current allocation, an inequity, and is trying to correct it. But I would say that there are times when there is a need for unequal spending. For example, there are some students whose parents can contribute a lot to their education. And there are some students whose parents can contribute less. So, for example, if you have two schools, and in one of the schools, the parents have the resources to, on their own, create a school library, there is no reason for the government to fund a school library. Instead, it would make sense for the government to use those resources and use them in the school where the parents don't have the resources to create the school library. So this might be perceived as inequitable, but in fact, it's trying to level the playing field. It's recognizing that students come from different backgrounds, and some have more advantages than others. And a reasonable way to think about the goal of education policy is to try to correct those imbalances. So that you know, I have another 10 minutes for our conversation, right? I had booked an hour for us. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. And my next question is also related with some transformative decisions on education in Azerbaijan. Within the framework of the state program aimed at increasing the international competitiveness of higher education in the Republic of Azerbaijan, every year 500 students are funded to pursue their studies at leading universities around the world. How would you evaluate such initiatives? Do you think that...
It's very difficult for me, without more knowledge of the context, to know that's a good or a bad. I mean, I guess the question is always, what else could you have done with those resources? If you ask me in general,
I wanted to ask exactly the same question, that what other areas of education should receive increased investment to ensure equitable learning opportunities for all, except for higher education?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you ask me in general, is it a good idea for citizens of one country to have the opportunity to study in other countries? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That brings to the country a series of global perspectives and relationships that can be very useful for economic development, for diplomacy, for all kinds of collaborations. I mean, new ideas come that way. So do I think it's a good idea to promote international education? Yes, I do. I think it's a good idea. The question of what is the cost of that initiative and what else could be done with those resources is a more difficult question. It's, in education policy, as you know, we're often not deciding whether an idea is good or bad. We're comparing ideas using a set of criteria. And so the question is, well, what are the most important criteria at this time? And that's where I don't know enough about Azerbaijan to know what the right criteria are. Well, let me give you two different scenarios. One scenario is Azerbaijan is trying to accelerate the integration of Azerbaijan into the world economy. If that's a priority, and you could say, well, the criteria is accelerating that integration, it seems to me that opportunities for students to study abroad are well aligned with that. There may be other ways to do the same thing. There may be ways to build relationships between universities and others, connecting with programs like Fulbright that bring others. There may be ways to develop international mindedness in the curriculum of high schools, even elementary schools. So there may be a range of options to do that, and it would be possible to compare them in terms of how transformative they are, how many people are impacted, and what is their cost. But if the criteria, on the other hand, is one where Azerbaijan says our biggest priority in the country at the moment is to address inequality. We have a lot of people who feel excluded, who are excluded, and we need to prioritize giving everybody a fair chance. If that's the goal, and not everybody has access to a good elementary education, then the idea of sending people abroad may not be as valuable as the idea of concentrating resources in providing everybody a chance. So, see, education policy is not about saying, well, this policy will always be the best policy. A policy is a good or a bad policy at a particular moment, in a particular place, relative to a particular set of goals and constraints and needs.
Cənab Fernando, vaxtımızın məhdud olduğunu nəzərə alaraq iki sualı birləşdirmək istəyirəm. Təsəvvürünüzdəki ideal dərs modelini necə canlandırardınız? Hansı modelə üstünlük verərdiniz? Ümumiyyətlə, xarakterin formalaşdırılması və iradə tərbiyəsinin tənzimlənməsi baxımından təhsil prosesi özünü necə təkmilləşdirə bilər?
Yeah, so obviously, I think one important goal of education is to help people develop their full potential. And the full potential is about developing the whole human being. It's not only developing their cognitive skills, it's developing a sense of who they are. It's helping them develop their aspirations, their motivation, their capacity to treat others, and so on. And some people call that civic education. Some people call that character education. Some people call that whole child education. Some people call that social-emotional development. No matter how you call it, I think that should be a goal of an education system, to provide a holistic education to students so that each person can reach their full potential and become contributing members of their communities. And I certainly think that developing a curiosity about the world and an understanding of how we fit in the world is a part of that development of the citizenship skills or the character of the students. Understanding that we don't live in isolated communities. You may live in a particular community, you understand that community, you belong to that community, but you also understand what you have in common and what is different from the community next door and the other community and communities even across boundaries. And that is what I call global citizenship education, a topic that I have worked on and which I have discussed with Jafar some years ago.
Sadəcə bir sualın cavabına ehtiyacımız var. Düşünək ki, auditoriyada yeniyetmə Fernando əyləşib. Ona nə məsləhət görərdiniz?
I think it would be curious and look for ways to satisfy your curiosity, because there are many ways these days. Basically, I think that you develop a sense of who you are in the world by testing your ideas, by acting on your questions, by acting in your curiosities. Have the confidence that there are many means for you to pursue your curiosity. Hopefully, those means are within your school, but maybe they're not in the classroom. Maybe they are in the library. Maybe they are in the theater group. Maybe they are in the group that you organize with your peers to create a science club or to go and take a walk in the mountains and so on. So be curious about the world and don't be afraid to look for ways to pursue your ideas, to pursue your questions, and develop the capacity to do this with other people. Don't try to answer those questions alone. Answer those questions in conversations with others. And I'm not just referring to intellectual conversations around a table or a classroom. Questions about your curiosity about climate change, in which you might say, what is causing that? So it would be great if you could pursue that curiosity in the classroom, but even if you can't, connect with other students and try to understand what is causing climate change, who's doing something about it, how is climate change impacting your community, is there anything that you could do? But maybe not climate change, maybe it's the way people relate to one another in your school or in your neighborhood. Be curious about that. Don't be afraid to ask why. Why are things this way? And could there be some other way? I think it was Bertrand Russell. No, it was George Bernard Shaw, who many years ago raised this wonderful question. Most people see the world as it is and ask the question, why? And I see the world of possibilities and I ask, why not? And I think that developing the capacity to ask why and why not is very important. And you do that as a result of engaging in what I call experiments. Life is a series of experiments in conversations with other people.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you so much, really.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Good talking with both of you. Be
Thank
well.
you so much, Professor.
Bye.
Bye.
Əziz təhsilşünaslar, Lalə Əliyeva və Cəfər Mənsiminin təqdimatında Harvard dərsində idiniz. Növbəti Harvard dərsində görüşənədək.